Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I managed to read in May, and I'm super happy because I actually managed to read more than I did the previous month. If you guys haven't watched any of my previous videos or my previous wrap up, I only managed to read 2 books in April, and that was really dire considering that I actually managed to read 5 books, I think nearly every single month besides April. So this month I actually managed to read 7, and I also completed my Goodreads goal for the year, which was 20 books. I know that's not much, but I always tend to stick to something that I feel like I can achieve, because otherwise I just get really stressed. And it used to be 1 book, and then I changed it to 5 books, and then it was 12 books, and 20 books now I feel like is doable, and I've reached my goal, and in fact I've surpassed it. So without further ado, I'm just gonna get on with the video and tell you guys about the 7 books that I read in May. So the first book that I read in May was Mile High by Liz Tomford. This was actually, I believe, on my TBR. It's a hockey romance. It follows this woman named Stevie, and she works on private charter flights. This particular flight that she's going to be working on is actually going to be hosting a hockey team for their whole NHL season, and she basically meets this guy whose name I can't remember, which is terrible. So his name is Xanders. I think that's his last name, but like everyone calls him Xanders anyway, or like Z. And he is this stereotypical like cocky, sleeps with loads of women, hockey player, and she is just not taking his shit because her brother is actually a really massive like NBL basketball player, and so she's kind of used to the fame and kind of like being around very attractive men. So being around Xanders doesn't really faze her, and he loves that about her because obviously he's used to like groupies and like women who are really desperate. He basically has this whole persona in the media where he will leave his hockey matches with a different woman every time, and it's very kind of like open. However, underneath he is not like that at all, and he's actually like a really soft, like really honestly perfect guy. And obviously it's a romance is gonna ensue, and I loved every second of reading this book. First of all, love the fact that Stevie is an air hostess, because that is something that really fascinates me, especially people that do private charter flights. I don't know what it is, it seems more glamorous than it probably is, but I love that about it. Now this book is like, I think it's 600 odd pages long, and I did mention this in my reading vlog that I did, and I feel like it could have been whittled down a little bit. It was a lot. It was very long, and I do see why people might not like this because of that. And honestly, I feel like a lot of people would also stop reading because this is a romance book. There's only so much that you can write in a book, and I feel like fantasy, 600 pages, okay, like viable, but like a romance book, it kept me engaged, but I just can't see that it would keep anyone else engaged. This book has plus size rep, and Stevie gives off this very like confident energy. However, underneath she can be very insecure, and mostly it's because of what people think of her. She has a very kind of strained relationship with her mother, which I really enjoyed reading about. And one of the things that I loved about the relationship in this book is that Xanders is very like gentle with her, and will literally tell her, look in the mirror, tell me what you think is wrong, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. And he is just adorable, and they are adorable, and I just love this book. I love the way that it ended. Usually I'm used to reading romance books where the ending is very like white picket fence, you know, they get married, they have a kid, and it's happily ever after, and I'm not a huge fan of those endings. I like them because they're happy, and sometimes all I want is a happy ending. For me it's not very relatable. I don't want kids, I've mentioned this before, and so like when it's a stereotypical gets married, has kids, has a house, I'm like, ugh, again, really? But I really enjoyed the ending of this one. I am just so excited to move on with the second book because it follows Stevie's brother. I do feel like this book was a little bit predictable, but I do feel like I've read a lot of romance now where it's obviously predictable what's going to happen, but I kind of like that predictability about romance books because sometimes I don't want to be shocked. I just want something that's going to give me fuzzy feelings, and that's what I got with this book. And I'm just so happy that I enjoyed this more than I did because it was very like unexpected. Anyway, 4 stars, absolutely loved it. Really long, but if you can stick with it, you might like it. The second book that I read in May was Throttled by Lauren Asher. This was actually my first ever Lauren Asher book. I rated it 3 stars. I really thought it was okay. I enjoyed it. I liked the romance aspect to it. It has kind of like a forbidden romance feel. So this basically follows this young woman named Maya, and she's just graduated from university, and her brother has just received this massive like Formula 1 contract where he is going to be on a team with a guy named Noah Slade, who he has a little bit of beef beef with because he ended up crashing into Noah in one of like the really massive tournaments, and so Maya decides that she doesn't know what she wants to do with her life. So her brother is like, I really want you with me for the whole Formula 1 season, and so Maya follows him around. She vlogs, you know, she loves doing social media, and that's what she does. And like the forbidden romance kind of comes in with Noah because obviously Noah is her brother's rival, and obviously if something happens between them they kind of have to keep it private. Anyway, I really enjoyed this. Again, it was really predictable, kind of like everything that was going to happen was, you could foresee it coming. I do wish that there was more kind of build up to Noah and his dad, because Noah has a strained relationship with his father. His father is very physically and I'd say mentally abusive, and his mum is just not around. And I do wish that there was more kind of scenes with them, and I do wish that there was more confrontation between, you know, him and his dad, and also like, you know, Maya finding out and whatever. I just wish that there was more going on with that. I do feel like it was wrapped up very quickly. I also don't like Maya's brother. I think he was an arse. He had this thing where he was like, oh, I've got my career and all of this, and you need to decide what you're doing, and you're a grown adult now, like decide. And he was just awful. He basically decided like, I want my sister with me for this whole Formula 1 season, but then I'm gonna tell her that she needs to stop following me around and figure out what she's doing with her life. And I hated that. Like, why would you invite her and then tell her like, stop following me around, you need to decide what you're doing? I would definitely say that the second half of this book was better than the first half. I feel like the first half was a little bit slow going, and honestly I didn't know whether I was gonna get into that, but eventually I did. I really enjoyed the romance. I love like the forbidden aspect to it. Noah was obviously again one of these guys that's like very cocky and all of that, but he has like kind of like this soft centre. I really enjoyed this. I'm definitely going to carry on with this series because obviously it is a series. It's called the Dirty Air series. It follows, I'm going to guess it follows each of the Formula 1 drivers, and I do believe I know who the next book follows, so I'm gonna carry on with it. I really enjoyed it. It's nice to just pick up something that you know is easy to read and you're gonna enjoy. So carrying on with the sports romance theme, the third book that I read in May was Culty by Mariana Zapata. This is a football based romance, or soccer if you're American, and it follows this young woman named Sal, and she is essentially like a professional like player on like a women's squad, and she has idolized this guy named Culty for like her whole career, from when she was a kid all the way up until she actually started her football career. And eventually in this book, Culty actually comes along to the team to be one of the coaches, and obviously again there's like this forbidden romance element. I'm gonna admit that this book was really slow going. I actually ended up rating it a 3-star, which actually really pains me because I loved From Luke Off With Love. It's probably my favourite Mariana Zapata book so far. I've only read these two, but that one is still my favourite. The book was slow going. It was really long, and honestly I felt like this might have eventually got me into a slump. I just did not feel the chemistry at the beginning between these two characters. Culty basically doesn't speak for like 40% of the book. He says absolutely nothing. There is nothing going on between them. He just hates her. Like, he's just glaring at her and not even looking at her when he says one word. Like, he just, I could not feel the chemistry. It was not happening for me. I did not feel it. There was no spark there. Now obviously Mariana Zapata is known for her slow burn romance, and I love a good slow burn, but this was slow. Like, I could not think of a slower romance off the top of my head. I also do feel like there was a lot of football referencing, and I'm not like a football girly. I've just never been into football. I also found the romance a little bit weird. Like, I was into it at the end, but honestly, even thinking about it now, it made me feel weird. And this is the funny part. I read books, okay, where the age gap is like some 17-year-old girl and some 300-year-old like fae guy, and that doesn't creep me out. But the fact that, like, okay, I think there's a 13 years age difference between Sal and Culty, which isn't weird. Like, that happens in the real world. It's when I think about it in the real world, it doesn't seem that weird. But when I was reading this book, I think what made it weird was the fact that Sal would talk about the fact that she idolized this guy when she was a kid, and he was in like his mid-20s, and then all of a sudden they're friends, and you get to the end of the book and romantic things are happening, and it just made me feel odd. It made me feel uncomfortable. And I don't know why, because I've read worse age gaps. But this one made me feel, I think it was just the mention of the fact that she was a kid idolising this guy who was an adult, and then all of a sudden they're both adults and they're feeling things. I don't know what it was, it made me feel a little bit weird. I do have to say that there was a scene in this book that had me cackling, and I mentioned this in my reading vlog and I have to mention it here because I know not everyone's going to watch that. There is a scene where Sal at the beginning does this conference and she does something embarrassing and the people that witness it think it's incredibly funny, and you don't find out what happened until like pretty much the end of the book, and when it's mentioned I was laughing out loud, okay? Even thinking about it now makes me laugh because it's relatable. I can see myself doing something like that because my mind doesn't catch up with my mouth, and honestly I'll never forget it. It was hilarious, and I think for that alone I would have given it 5 stars. As it is, I gave the book a 3 star. I would say the last 60% of the book I would have given a 4 star, but like honestly it was so slow that I feel like it would have sent me into a slump, and in fact I honestly felt like my romance mood was dwindling. So the 4th book that I read in May was actually a short story, and it's called The 6 Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. This is a fantasy short story. It basically follows this woman who, or I guess she's like really young at the time, and she is essentially seen by this prince of the land. You know, she's kind of like poor. I think she's like an orphan, and this prince basically comes to her, takes her under his wing, and she becomes this person that kind of helps him to overthrow parts of the land, so like he gains more land and like has more power and whatever, and eventually she just lives this same day over and over and over again. This book is like 30 pages long. I finished this within I think an hour. I'm a slow reader, don't judge me, okay? 30 pages in an hour is pretty good for me. This was actually my first experience reading a short story, especially like a fantasy short story, because I feel like short stories, although I think this is the first one I've read, I feel like they could go either way on the spectrum. Either they can give you so very little and be really bad, or they can give you too much and you want more. And I do feel like this was a good place in the middle. Like it gave me enough that I would enjoy reading more, but also I was satisfied enough to be like, okay, like I'm good with this. This book is told in like a second person perspective, which is something that I'm not really overly used to reading, but I did really enjoy it. The book also has incredibly beautiful writing, and I do feel like that's why it has a lot of higher star ratings. But I do feel like if this book was longer and it was written in that way, I do feel like I would have struggled to read more. So just bear that in mind. Like I did read some reviews where some people were like, this is beautiful writing and nothing more. So I feel like you could go either way with this book. You could either really love it or really not like it, but I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. There's really not much else to say. I feel like this is one of those ones where you just have to read it and see what you think for yourself. After reading this book, I actually do have an interest in reading more short stories, so if you guys have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below because I'm interested to see if there are any really good ones out there. So the 5th book that I managed to read in May was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This was also, I think, one of my TBR books, and I've been putting it off immensely because I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo at the end of last year, and honestly I had this feeling ingrained in me that if I read another Taylor Jenkins Reid book, it wouldn't live up to the hype and I wouldn't enjoy it as much. And I was so like, I'm always scared when it comes to that. Like even when I've read a series by an author that I absolutely love, when the next sequel comes out, I'm always terrified that I'm not going to enjoy it, and that's exactly how I felt going into this book. So this for me, I rated it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't as good as The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo for me. That's just personal preference. But I did really enjoy it. It gave me kind of like, no, it's not exactly the same, but it did give me kind of like Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow vibes, in the sense that this kind of feels like a love story, but it's not. And it's incredibly harrowing. And honestly, is there any Taylor Jenkins Reid book that is happy? Because I felt so sad reading this. It didn't make me cry, but it left me feeling so empty and heartbroken by the end. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. So this takes place, I believe, in the 70s, and it basically follows this kind of band called Daisy Jones and the Six. It originally starts off as the Six, and then Daisy Jones kind of comes along. She kind of tours with the Six, or does a song with the Six, and they love her so much that they decide to take her on board. And I can't remember all of the band members' names, but the main one is Billy, and Billy kind of like oversees this band. He kind of controls everything. He kind of hates the fact that Daisy Jones kind of mixes it up a bit and kind of takes over slightly, and like he just doesn't like the fact that people like her so much and whatever. There's a lot of like drug use in this book. Obviously it's the 70s, and Billy basically has this woman who he's dated for a very long time. He's married to her, he has kids. He dealt with his own kind of alcohol and drug misuse and has basically become sober, and so he kind of like stays away from that whole scene. But Daisy coming into it kind of mixes it up because she is still involved with all that stuff, and obviously they can see her kind of dwindling, and she just becomes this kind of shell of a person. And this book basically follows them through their career, and essentially it is told kind of like in an interview manner. So it's almost similar to The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, where you're kind of reading this story where each of the band members is kind of narrating the timeline, which was incredibly different to read, and I didn't know whether I'd be into it at first, but I actually really enjoyed it because each chapter you're dealing with a new kind of part of the story to eventually this point where you see why the band kind of went their separate ways and why it ended. There's a little twist at the end which I really enjoyed, like I wasn't expecting it, and I just thoroughly enjoyed this. I love the fact that whenever I read a Taylor Jenkins Reid book now, she just manages to immerse me in this decade that I wasn't born in, and I feel like I'm there. I feel like I'm experiencing it. And I also love the fact that she writes these incredibly flawed characters who I can't help but love and root for. And honestly, she's broken my heart twice now, so I think I'm just gonna go into the next Taylor Jenkins Reid book expecting to have my heart absolutely pummeled with a mallet. So the sixth book that I read in May was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. This is a romance, and I did not expect to love this as much as I did. I gave this a big fat 5 stars, and I would never take that back. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did, but oh my god, it has not left my brain since. Adam Carlson has been added to the list of book boyfriends, and I think he's somewhere at the top. So this follows this young woman named Olive who is in the 3rd year of her PhD, and she happens to end up in a fake dating scenario with this guy named Adam Carlson, who happens to be a professor at the university she's attending. And essentially her best friend wants to like this guy who Olive kind of barely dated and doesn't really care about, and she wants her best friend to date this guy because she knows that they would be great together, but her best friend is holding off. She doesn't want to break the best friend code, and so Olive ends up kissing Adam Carlson. Her best friends end up seeing, and then they end up in this whole fake dating thing because her best friend is like, oh my god, you kissed him, and are you dating? Like, what's going on? And Olive is like, yeah, we're dating, like, and they have to date and do all these things. I just loved this. This gave me all the fuzzy feeling vibes and women in science. First of all, Adam Carlson is the biggest green flag. Like, even when it came to the sprinkling of smart, the biggest green flag. The biggest green flag. Oh my god, I loved him. He made me blush. I love this book. Why did it take me so long to read it? The only negative thing that I would say about this was at the beginning. Now, this is technically a Kylo Ren fan fiction, and I'm gonna admit I don't get the obsession with Kylo Ren and the guy that plays Kylo Ren. I can't remember his name. Adam Driver. I don't get the obsession. He's a great actor, and I loved those Star Wars films, and I'm gonna admit I did really like Kylo Ren in those. I just don't get the obsession with Adam Driver, but I really struggled to kind of get Adam Driver out of my head when I was reading this. Eventually I did manage to not picture him and hear his voice, but it was a struggle for me. So if you already know that this is a fan fiction, just know you might be unable to do the same. It was a struggle, but eventually I managed to picture and like make up my own voice, so it wasn't too bad, but the struggle was real at the beginning, and honestly I felt like if it had gone that way throughout I would have rated this lower. One of the biggest factors as to why I love this book, and this was only really towards the end, kind of like when the smutty stuff was happening. I loved kind of like the mentionings of Olive's previous sexual experiences and relationships, because I have never related to a character more in my life, and I'm very annoyed because my camera decided to stop recording halfway through when I was talking about one of the books. So I was talking about the love hypothesis. What I was saying was it was just nice to read about a character who I felt like I could relate to finally. I don't know what else I said because I just had to skip to the last frame and see what I recorded, which is very annoying and frustrating. The other thing that I wanted to mention was I loved the conflict in this book because it just felt very appropriate for the setting, and I also liked the pacing of it. Like, I don't feel like it felt out of place, I don't feel like it felt rushed, and I really liked the way that it was handled. But overall, I cannot wait to read more Ali Hazelwood books. 5-star read, gave me all the fuzzy feeling vibes. Adam Carlson was a green freaking flag, and I loved it. And I didn't expect to like this book as much as I did because it's very much a Booktok hyped book, but Booktok, you've done me good. Thank you. So the 7th and final book that I read in May was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is a very short book. I think it comes in around about 200 odd pages long, and I gave it 3 stars, and I was expecting to like it much more than I did. So this book essentially follows a woman named Miri and a woman named Leah, and they are married, and Leah is essentially like a marine biologist of some sort, and she spends a lot of time like under the sea in like, you know, submersible things. I was gonna say boats, but boats float. Submersible, it's not a device, is it? I do know English, it's just sometimes very hard when I've got the camera rolling to think of words off the top of my head. Anyway, she ends up in submersible things. You know what I'm on about, right? Like submarines, that kind of thing. And Leah goes on this 3-week research trip, which ends up becoming a 5-month trip. Basically, something goes wrong, the comms start working, they can't use any of the switches, they end up somewhere on the bottom of the seabed, they don't know how far down they are, weird things start happening, and then eventually when Leah comes back after 5 months, Miri notices that she's not the same wife that she had before. She's acting very strangely, she won't eat, she won't drink, she won't talk, and weird things start happening to her body, like she starts bleeding a lot from her mouth and her nose, and her skin's going all weird, like just weird things start happening. This book does have horror-esque elements in it that I really enjoyed, however I kind of expected to have more horror in it than I did. I really expected to end this book having all of my questions answered, and honestly I didn't. Like, there's a lot of build up, and in Miri's chapters in particular, she kind of puts an emphasis on trying to contact the organisation that Leah works for to try and get answers and to try and get them to help. And a lot of emphasis is put on that, but then nothing is resolved at the end. It's kind of just like, these weird things are happening, deal with it, and we're not going to give you any answers as to what's happened. But also not only that, but when Leah is on the seabed, these weird things that are happening, you don't really get answers for. And I think I was expecting this book to be more of a horror kind of like thriller thing, and it just wasn't. The book does have beautiful writing, which I did quite enjoy, and I feel like if you're someone who goes into a book just for writing alone and you don't really care for the plot, I would say that this might be a new favourite for you. I did really enjoy the way that the sea was described, especially in Leah's chapters, because she tends to know a lot about that. I love the way that everything was described in this book because it felt like how I felt about the sea. Like, it gave me fear. It was making me sweat. I do feel like this book though is more about kind of the love story between Miri and Leah. Obviously Leah's chapters are more about her being on the ocean floor, although she does mention her relationship with Leah and like how she's feeling at the time. But Miri's chapters are literally all about hers and Leah's relationship and kind of like how it started and like how it blossomed, and that's pretty much all it is. It's kind of like a love story and kind of like gradually seeing it unfold and then kind of like flop when Leah comes back. And yeah, it has beautiful writing, and I feel like if that is what you're into, this might be a new favourite. But for me, it was okay, but honestly I struggled to read it sometimes and it felt longer than it actually is. It's like a 200 page book, but I struggled. I rated it 3 stars. It was okay. If this sounds like your thing, give it a go, but I don't really think it was my thing. So those were all of the books that I read in May. Please leave a comment below if you've read any of the books that I did and let me know what you thought of them. If you like this video, please don't forget to give it a like and please subscribe if you want to see more content from me. And until the next video, I will see you then. So bye guys.